Chapter 2, The Jewish Diaspora and My Family History. First, let's define the term diaspora, which in Hebrew is called galut. It comes from the word dispersion, which refers to a nation of people that scatter throughout the globe, away from their homeland. As I strongly believe that Israel is an exclusively Jewish homeland, which I know many would like to disagree. I wholeheartedly base that belief upon history and God's promises in the full, complete Bible, Old and the New Testament. How reliable the Bible is, a whole other question that we will discuss in later topics. Nevertheless, due to the fact that the Jewish people were migrating away from their homeland for many reasons throughout biblical and modern history, Jewish people have been divided into different sections, thus acculturating into the different regions that they migrated to, which caused specific Jewish customs to change. In other words, some put emphasis on one tradition and practice, and some put emphasis on another. Also, their skin pigmentation is different from one another due to possible mutations and probably some intermixing. Can't avoid that. But their Jewish identity has been preserved throughout their years from generation to generation. Furthermore, some have adopted the last names of the origin that they have migrated to. And through generations, again, those names have earned and evolved into becoming typical Jewish names. Among Jewish people that have been in the galut, away from Israel, they can easily recognize and determine amongst themselves who is Jewish or not based on a person's last name. On top of that, some general physical features have been typical to being Jewish, which are known to be Semitic features. The Jewish nation, along with the Arab, has originated from the line of Sem, which in Hebrew is Shem, who was one of the three sons of Noah. Abraham came from the line of Sem. Thus, the Jewish and the Arab people have very similar facial features. Noah's youngest son, however, was Ham, who saw the nakedness of his father, and his father cursed him for it, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." Genesis 9:25. Ham is the father of the Canaan, and I believe that the Hamites are the black people who were enslaved for a period of time, just like the Israelites, who also were promised to be slaves for 400 years. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years." Genesis 15:13. Knowing that, I particularly have a heart for the black people. Nonetheless, back to the Jewish people. Once in the diaspora, Jewish people developed a meticulousness of distinguishing themselves amongst each other due to anti-Semitism that's prevalent around the globe. That taught Jewish people how to spot each other out of the crowd. It is a sort of sense of paranoia that they've fostered over the years to be able to distinguish who is a possible enemy and who is close in blood. Typically, inherently Jewish people have round eyes and acutely protruding nose with a bend on it, which both my father and I have, only mine is not as pronounced. Most Jewish people have curly or wavy and very frizzy texture of hair. There are exceptions, of course. Most Americans here don't bother to notice such regularities because of the supreme melting pot. Generally speaking, in America, people accept everyone from every origin, hence the melting pot. Although, don't get too comfortable. There are haters. Now, let's talk about the different groups that the Jewish people over the years have been separated into due to the diaspora. The two major groups of Jewry are the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi. The Sephardic people are typically originate from Western Europe, such as Spain and Portugal, and the Ashkenazi come from France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Most Ashkenazi religious people speak Yiddish, which is a form of Germanic dialect, only it is made up of Hebrew letters. Sephardic people have their language among themselves too that is called Ladino, which is a dialect of Spanish with Hebrew letters. They have a dark complexion, dark eyes, and black hair. They look very similar to Mizrahim Jews, which are Middle Eastern Jews that have origin from Islamic countries such as Iraq, Iran, and such. They are the ones that stayed behind after the termination of the Babylonian captivity. However, some Islamic countries kicked them out as soon as the State of Israel was formed, of which we will talk in great detail later. The Ashkenazi Jews look more like Europeans, somewhat light-skinned Caucasian people, even though in some certain countries other than the USA, Ashkenazi Jews cannot classify themselves as Caucasian. A more minority group is Yemenite, in Hebrew Temanim, and Ethiopian Jews. The Yemenite Jews are so exquisite and well-rooted in their traditions. They pronounce the guttural sound of ch beautifully from the depths of the throat. In order to make that sound, you have to swallow some spit, mix it in your throat, and utter it from there. The Yemenite Jews are also very dark in complexion and have wide eyebrows, deep and defined eye sockets, and sharp jaws, similar looking to Sephardic Jews, but not exactly. The other group I mentioned is the Ethiopian Jews that claim their Jewishness from Solomon and Queen of Sheba. Those Jews look a lot like people of African descent, very dark-skinned. In Hebrew, they are called Kushi. Although they look similar to African people, there are some different subtleties in their facial structure. It is not as round and full. Their noses are a little bit smaller in size, and their hair, although it is comparatively as dark as the African person, is a little bit softer in texture. Ethiopian Jews are very rare. So which one of these subgroups do I belong to? Can any of you make a wild guess based on my picture in the back of the book? That's right. I am an Ashkenazi Jew and proud of it. My folks have come from the Soviet Union, more specifically Ukraine, which is in Eastern Europe. Amazingly, all of my relatives are Jewish in blood. My great-great-great-grandparents all kept their Jewish lineage from both sides. Here comes the narration of my family history. My knowledge extends to my great-great-grandparents from my maternal grandma's side. They were religious Jews, of which what it means I will divulge later. Right now, it is not of any importance. Their names were Ilya and Hannah. My grandmother, whom we will get to soon, remembers how her grandmother Hannah wistfully dreamed about immigrating to Palestine at the time. As usual, religious people have many kids. They had 9 of them. Beat that. 3 boys and 6 girls. 2 boys, according to what I was explained, were killed in battle during the fight against the Nazis. And the third one, which one it was, I don't know, has survived and fled to the United States. The 6 girls, respectively, to their birth were first one, Frida, 2, Nina, 3rd, Vera, 4th, Sima, 5th, Runya, and 6th, Fira. Of all of them, Nina was somehow caught and murdered by the Nazis. The 4th girl down from the list was my great-grandmother, born on March 23, 1916, whose name was Sima Levina, whom I mentioned earlier for being from the Levite descent. She died at age 86 on November 23, 2001, when I was almost 11 years old. And she is buried, as her very own mother dreamed, in the heart of Jerusalem. The entire family during their growing years lived in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. In a small and rural village called Pavlahrad. Runia outlived my great-grandmother and all of the rest of the sisters, but folks remember her because she's a part of my childhood. Runia had 3 children, Yura, Ala, and Luda. Through my unconscious years of life, Yura was involved in my mother's and my own life. Through my conscious childhood, we will mostly concentrate on Allah, who is married to Abraham, nicknamed Abrasha, who had 2 daughters, Ira and Ola. Those are the Podolsky family. Ira has a son named Ilya, whom we affectionately call Ilusha, who was older than me. Ola was married to Misha, who at the time acted like a father figure to me when I most needed one, who has a young son named Ron. Ron is 3 years younger than me, and we practically grew up together, almost like a brother and sister, before he started having siblings. Later on in my story, we will meet another relative who was the son of Vera, the 3rd girl, sister of my great-grandmother, whose name was Syoma Silutina. He greatly helped me through my circumstances. Unfortunately, he died around 2005 from lung cancer. He was my grandmother's cousin. Before I get into the story of my great-grandmother, I would like to spend a moment to talk to you about what the Holocaust looked like in Ukraine. There was a place called Babi Yar, which was in the heart of Kiev, the capital, a distance away from the area that my maternal grandmother's relatives originated from. The Babi Yar, as it was told to me, was a well that was dug 5 meters deep, which is 16.4 feet. What the Nazis did was line up alongside those walls all the women, children, and elderly folks that were, of course, Jewish and in complete nakedness in the midst of sheer coldness. In return, what the Nazis did was, from the place that they were standing, turn around from facing the victims and take 5 steps in the opposite direction. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, shoot! On the shoot, they turned around facing the victims and shot at them. Those bullets flew directly towards the bareness of their living flesh. The cylindrical metal of the bullet unceremoniously penetrated through the tightness of the skin, wounding their feeble bodies, which created an intolerable surge of pain. The person at target, as a result, lost balance and fell back right inside the pit. And the Nazis continued the process, line by line, thus breathing bodies piled up on top of each other. And eventually the Nazis started shoveling the dirt to cover the victims while those bodies were alive and writhing in great discomfort, convulsing out of breath. The earth, in every sense of the expression, was breathing, exhale and inhale, once the Nazis were complete with their operation. Eventually, in a very tormenting while, as the earth looked like a diaphragm that ascends and descends through suffocation, their spirits disengaged from their body into non-existence. Much like Cain murdered his brother Abel out of jealousy that God accepted Abel's offering and not his. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Genesis 4:9-10. Anyway, none of my maternal grandma's relatives had been killed there in such a way, but on my father's side and my maternal grandpa's side, many were. To get a real example of how it was, my grandma, who raised me most of my life, told me this interesting story of a woman who had a 10-year-old son with her at the Babi Yar. I do not know his name, and how he relates to us is also unknown to me. Regardless of that, she put her son behind her so that when she was shot, she fell backwards onto her son, and the son, unwounded, carefully climbed up through the bodies without being noticed, removing the dirt that was flying towards him as the Nazis were shoveling, and pushed himself upward. This way, he made his way to freedom. He ran away and moved to the United States. On with my story. Before World War II, my great-grandmother, while living in some far-off village with her parents, met a gentleman named Israel Yasnogorodsky, which means a blooming Yasna city, Gorodsky, a Polish ending of a last name meaning descendant from there. Great-grandpa was a Jewish, devout communist. Great-grandma fell in love with him at 16 and married him in 1933 to become a strong-headed communist herself, just as her husband was. Although married, she never changed her last name, Levina, for reasons unknown to me, but I would make a conjecture that the last name meant something valuable to her. As a result of marrying him, she moved out of the village she was living in to the great capital city of Kiev, putting all of her family behind. Later on, she gave birth to 2 children, Willie and Kira, who are 1 year apart. Willie was born in 1934, and Kira, my grandmother, was born in 1935. My grandma was named after a known communist leader named Sergei Kirov that my great-grandmother looked up to. When my grandma turned 4 years old, her father, my great-grandpa, was drafted into World War II around 1939 and became a devout communist Soviet Union general. He died a month before the end of the war in Poland on the border of Germany. To be specific, he was hanged by them. My great-grandma was left with 2 hungry children to take care of. Anywhere there were rations, she was sure to share. She also rescued other love-seeking children of her sisters mentioned earlier. Hunger was a constant problem, though. When I was in 2nd grade in Israel, we had an assignment to ask our grandparents of an account of how they survived the Holocaust. This is what my grandma explained to me in a nutshell. When Hitler's forces were advancing to Kiev, Ukraine, my great-grandmother and her kids had to move to Siberia, thus avoiding the harsh waves of massacre of the Babi Yar. When the danger quieted down, they moved back to the Ukraine. Nina, great-grandmother's sister, was the only victim from the 6 girls who did not succeed in fleeing and died along with the 2 brothers who were in battle, only not in the Babi Yar. Willie and my grandma grew up. Willie had met a Jewish girl named Bella that he married, and they had a child named Igor, who later on married another Jewish girl named Yelena. Together, escaping these communist regimes and restrictive political parties that thwarted freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and spread an overwhelming surge of propaganda that carefully brainwashed its citizens, that side of the family, sensing that something had been amiss in this awkwardly utopian government, had the full intention to spread their wings across the ocean when opportunity arose around the year of 1978. At the time, to my assumption, the USA was in the middle of the Cold War, resolutely fighting communism around the world. In response to trying to obliterate it or to rescue people from engaging in it, the USA came up with a coaxing immigration program that enabled Soviet Union citizens that were against the idea of communism to immigrate into their land. Israel opened immigration possibilities for Jewish people across the world as well, but that will be discussed in detail later. At the time, the Soviet Union somewhat loosened its rules on immigration, so my great-uncle Willie took hold of the opportunity quickly. However, he had to ask permission from his parents, in this case my great-grandmother Sima, to sign the papers of his release. Those were the rules back then. No matter if you were of age and he was about 44. You had to get the signature of your parents to decide your destiny for you. Foolish, don't you think? My great-grandmother, as I said before, was a complete believer of the Communist Party, and she also liked to have that kind of control over her son. She refused to sign. Willie said to her that if she were not to sign, he would be willing to do something rebellious against the Communist Party and go to jail. My great-grandmother had no choice, and she reluctantly signed the papers. Willie called my grandmother, his sister, to move with him, but Grandma was too involved in the communist regimes, following after the footsteps of her mother, and had no suspicions of it like that rebellious Uncle Willie of mine. As a result, she remained loyal to her mother and stayed in the Soviet Union along with her side of the family. Willie, in return, said, "Hasta la vista, baby," and legally immigrated to the U.S. in 1978, where he eventually settled in the fast-paced, advanced society mode of California bloom. His son Igor developed a technical business, became prosperous, and had two boys, David and Andrew, in the States already. These are my great cousins, whom we will discuss later. In his staying in the United States, Willie remarried another Soviet Jewish immigrant named Rita around the year 2000. I believe I might be wrong. And he left behind his former wife, Bella, due to the fact that she started developing Alzheimer's. To my suspicion, she was probably unsettled by the fact that Willie had gone astray from her, which took a toll on her health. I wasn't told specifically what it was, but that is what I guess it was. What Mom and I agree is that during Willie's marriage with Bella, he was a lot more native to us, a lot more caring towards us and my grandmother, along with Willie's son and his family, and seemed to maintain a mind of his own. But as soon as he married Rita, he became, so to speak, in a Russian colloquial expression, an under-the-heel kind of man, which in Russian is podkabluchnik, meaning he doesn't think for himself. He always accommodates himself to whatever his wife says, takes on the priorities of her, and puts his behind even if they are sacrificial to his own priorities. In essence, he entered another communism, very well brainwashed. He doesn't have his own life, as it seems to me. You will see later on what I mean. Meanwhile, Grandma stayed, and I'm so very glad that she did, because I wouldn't have been born if she didn't. At times, I regret that I was, but overall, I'm brought into an ease through the acceptance of the fact that God put me forth on this earth for His reasons, so I might as well rejoice in my existence. To rewind a little bit, my grandmother grew to become a professional gymnast. She coached young teenagers on athletic activities in a renowned athletic company called Spartak that was also known to have coached Soviet Union Olympic participants. According to my father's account, he claims it wasn't Spartak, rather it was an institution where my mom worked as an accountant with her. I know Mom worked there because Grandma told me how she threw her clothes in the elevator for my mom to dress in because she was late one day. However, I don't doubt that Grandma worked at Spartak too, because when we were living in Israel, Grandma introduced me to her former colleagues from Spartak. So I would put two and two together that maybe at the time that my father entered the family, grandmother's employment had changed. Before becoming an official coach, though, she attended various significant parades for the nation, such as Moscow's 800th anniversary in 1947. She did all kinds of stunts and tricks. Also, when she became a mom, she liked to organize children's camps. When Grandma was a coach, she had to hide her real name, which is Kira Israelovna. In the Soviet Union republics, which are now independent countries, your middle name was determined by the first name of your father. Because she is a woman, it is Israelovna, from her father's name, Israel. If she were a man, it would have been Israelevich, who my great-uncle is. It was accustomed to call each other in the professional arenas by your name and your, so to speak, middle name, the name of your father, which in Russian is called отчество. That is twisted accordingly to suit the gender. It is somewhat like in the Bible when you put a name and the word Ben is used after that, which means son, like for example, Joshua ben Nun, mentioned earlier, Joshua the son of Nun, who led the Israelites after Moses' death. It is the same way in the Soviet Union and to this day in Russian-speaking countries to keep track of the names of their father. Grandma hid that отчество from people because it obviously sounds very Jewish. So in order not to get into complications with the public, she called herself Kira Ivanovna, from the name Ivan, which is a typical Russian-blooded name that no one would suspect. Another thing Gentiles believed was that Jewish people had horns, from a mistranslation in the Bible about Moses coming down the mountain. It said that a ray of light was upon his face. Keren or panav bedabro ito. However, the word ray, keren in Hebrew, has two meanings, horn and ray. Because of the silly mistranslation, it was believed that Jewish people have naturally implanted horns. Even Michelangelo depicted Moses with horns. Check that on Google. You will see the exact statue that he carved of Moses. Grandma complained to me often that people, upon knowing she was Jewish, tried to touch her scalp to feel the horns, which appeared somewhat amusing to me. Speaking of Spartak, my grandma told me once this very funny experience when she worked there. One day she woke up and was in a hurry and her mind wandered. She wore a shirt, leggings, underwear, all that is expected. Then she wore a big heavy coat because it is freezing in Kyiv. She didn't forget that. When she came to her work site, she took off the coat and everybody stared at her in awe, asking, Kira, is this a new fashion of yours? Yes, that is. She put her hands up to her waist, moving her hips side to side with an unsuspicious grin in her face, thinking that she was altogether classy. Then she looked down and a flow of befuddlement rushed through her veins. She was blushing like a tomato and quickly excused herself, taking the overcoat and never forgetting this experience. She forgot to wear her skirt. As I listened to it, I was hysterically laughing on the floor. In March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin died, the infamous dictator of the Soviet Union. The entire nation was overwhelmed with sadness as well as my grandma. She highly revered Stalin, believe it or not. Later on, she found out that he was a liar, a murderer of his own people, a dictator, and a major self-suitor. Communism is a form of government where everybody does things collectively, but at the same time, it is rigid in every way that it conducts its business. It's kind of like, do as I say and don't question the government for its ways, otherwise you will be punished. My grandmother adopted that sort of thinking and discipline in raising her children and grandchildren. She liked to take the ultimate control, and if rebelled against, punishment was at your door, physically, I mean. You will notice that later on in my narrative. My grandmother married in 1958 a Jewish fellow named Peter Viprinsky, which comes from the word vipar, a bull. My grandmother very well lives up to that last name as she took it. Grandpa Peter was an engineer and a director at some firm that Willie's second wife, Rita, had worked at. That's how I suspect they knew of each other's existence. Grandmother was married for 27 years, which is a long time, happily married, I believe. They settled in a 3-room apartment on a street in Kyiv next to a lavish street called Darnitsa. She had 2 daughters. One was born in 1961 and named Anna, and the other, my dear mother, Yelena, was born in 1967. My grandpa left my grandmother in 1984 when Mom was about 18. It was the most memorable and the most horrifying experience Grandma has ever gone through, and she can never, to this day, forgive him. My grandpa was caught cheating. Not by Grandma, but by my aunt, as far as it was told to me. My aunt told my grandma, and that was the end. the abrupt partition of the sacred union. She, to this date, blames him for it. It broke the entire family apart. For that reason, upon my birth, Grandma hid the existence of Grandpa throughout my entire childhood for the sake of holding a grudge. Upon my inquiring of him, "Dead!" she exclaimed, point blank, no further questions. I found of his existence through my father and still doubted, but it soon was confirmed after Grandpa sent me rollerblades at around 10. Mom herself said it had been from him, all while Grandma was stubbornly denying him until there came a point that she could no longer deny his existence in front of me. Grandpa, however, remarried a Gentile, a Ukrainian woman named Masha. I don't know if that was the lady whom my grandpa cheated on my grandma with. She always cursed the existence of that woman. So I suspect she is the one, and I don't dare to ask. After my grandpa, Grandma has never remarried, as she damned all the existence of men. My grandpa was Padla, bastard number 1. My father was Padla, number 2, and Mom's third husband, Tolik, the third. One side note is that I have complete sympathy for my grandfather. My grandma is so hard to live with, so hard to get along with. Her word is inscribed in stone commandment. There is no bouncing off ideas. There is no camaraderie about plans. It is only about her and the children. She is so obsessively dedicated to her children and her grandchildren that I believe Grandpa felt alone and unnoticed, so he was tempted with other forbidden fruits on the tree. It says in the Bible, "Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them." Colossians 3:18-19. In other words, don't be domineering over your husbands. The institution of marriage is the symbolism of how Christ will marry the church, the bride, in which Christ is the leader, just like husbands should be spiritual leaders of the marriage. We'll talk about this extensively later. However, at the same time, I can understand my grandmother's attitude, as she was exemplifying the way my great-grandmother had dealt with the circumstances since she was widowed, putting all of her attention onto her kids to feed them and help them survive. The problem is contingent upon that a person can't apply the same attitude on life onto varying circumstances. What you need to do is analyze your circumstances, nip in the bud your habits, and create different attitudes on life that will be more applicable to your given circumstances instead of generalizing it all across your entire life circumstances. It's called update. Many technological gadgets do so better than human beings. We always need to update our moral standing, our values, and our priorities. Also, instead of always blaming others for what has happened to my grandmother, I think it would have been beneficial to sit and analyze our own mistakes and shortcomings and to move on with a forgiving heart. It is interesting how we are unwilling to forgive people who transgress against us, as God readily wants to forgive our transgressions against Him. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. Matthew 6:15. It is too much to ask, though, because my family never was good in analysis, which is a soul-searching state of being, flashbacking the events of a person's life and trying to make sense of it to reach a sense of forgiveness. My family, however, miserably fails on this subject of forgiveness as well. Grandma had a husband, and she had to find a balance between her husband and the children, like all people, like all marriages. Grandma never knew how to do that. In return, when one tops the other, the plate that keeps everything in balance shatters into splintery pieces.